In our last two lessons, we focused on how print culture evolved in two East Asian countries, which were China and Japan. Now these were the places where printing technology evolved for the first time in the whole wide world. But how did print culture make its way to Europe from the far away East Asian countries? Well, this is what we will be focusing on in today's discussion. Well, this discussion will be devoted to understanding how print came to Europe and how over the years it evolved and went on to taking new shapes. Now, if we are to trace how print techniques made their way to Europe, we will have to go back to a time when trade activities used to happen between the Asian countries and the European countries. So let us now go back to the medieval period. Now in the medieval period, Europe was one of the chief importers of Chinese silk and spices. Now how do you think these Chinese silk and spices entered Europe? China is so far away from the European countries. Well, for the purpose of this trade, there existed a route which was known as the Silk Route. And here this red line shows you the Silk Route, and it is through this Silk Route that trade activities used to happen between China and the European countries. Now it is with the help of this Silk Route that paper entered Europe in the 11th century. Now prior to this, paper was not in use in Europe. In our first lesson on this series of lessons on print culture, we learned about how till a point of time it was China who used to exist monopoly over printed materials. And it is from China itself that paper entered Europe through the Silk Route in 11th century. And this entry of paper in Europe now facilitated the production of manuscripts, because European manuscripts were written on the papers which made their way to Europe from China through the Silk Route. When we have to talk about the beginning of printing technologies in Europe, all credits are due to the Italian merchant, explorer and writer Marco Polo. Well, what do you think Marco Polo did in this regard? Well, Marco Polo was an Italian explorer and merchant who toured many countries throughout his life. And it was finally in the year 1295 that Marco Polo entered Italy from China. Now he did a very crucial thing in this year, because with him he now brought the knowledge of woodblock printing. So earlier on, it was during the 11th century that paper made its way to Europe from China through the Silk Route, and finally it was in the year 1295 that this new technique called woodblock printing made its way to Europe, and all thanks to Marco Polo. Now when print came to Europe, it immediately flourished to a great extent, because printing technology is of immense importance to humankind. So many kinds of things can be printed simply with the help of this printing technology. And Marco Polo introduced this woodblock printing technology in Italy, and over the years this now spread throughout different parts of Europe. But you will be surprised to know that there still existed many sections of the population who were not really fond of using printed materials. But printing technology has been such a boon to humankind. So many kinds of things can be printed on paper and different other surfaces, and then those can be spread among the masses. But why do you think were these people not in favor of printed materials? Because the aristocratic circles as well as the monastic libraries used to consider printed materials as cheap and vulgar. because for many hundred years these aristocratic circles as well as these monastic libraries have been using a different kind of thing, and this thing is something that they still continue to use. So despite the spread of printing technology around this point of time, an expensive parchment paper known as vellum, which was made from animal skins, was still being used for the writing of luxury editions of different things. So this is the parchment called vellum, and on this different kinds of things were still being written on. So these were now handwritten manuscripts which were being written on vellum, simply because these aristocratic people as well as the monastic libraries considered that these printed materials were quite cheap and vulgar. When human beings are introduced to something new and useful, there is no way of stopping them. It happened likewise in Europe as well. When the printing technology was slowly spreading throughout Europe, more and more books were now being required by people. So the demand for books increased, which is why the production of books also needed to be increased. So around this time, the demand for books increased and book fairs were now being organized at different parts of Europe. And in these European book fairs, many booksellers used to assemble. They used to gather together and then export their books to different countries. Well, this is how the printing technology was now spreading throughout Europe. Firstly, it made its way from China to Italy, and now it was spreading its wings throughout different European countries. Now the booksellers realized that they would have to do something in order to meet the growing demands of books. More and more people were wanting to read more and more books. And how could the booksellers meet such an ever-increasing demand for books? Which is why they now realized that the production of handwritten manuscripts should be properly organized. Now, who produced these handwritten manuscripts? There were scribes for this reason. Now, scribes were the people who meticulously wrote and copied down different manuscripts on paper. So, it was a very laborious and time-taking task to do so. But the booksellers realized that in order to meet the growing demands of books, they should now, and the scribes were now being appointed by both wealthy patrons as well as the booksellers. Now the wealthy patrons were the ones who wanted their own customized books. These wealthy patrons were the ones who were not very fond of using printed materials, which is why they appointed the scribes. And at the same time, the booksellers, realizing that they required the help and proper organization of the scribes in order to meet the growing demands, also appointed the scribes. Now you will be surprised to know that at certain points of times, many booksellers used to have 50 to 60 scribes each, and these scribes used to copiously write down many manuscripts every day. And in this way, the booksellers were trying to meet the growing demands of books, but unfortunately, they realized that handwritten manuscripts are not of great use. This is because handwritten manuscripts were not being able to meet the growing demands of more and more books. Now, there are many disadvantages of using handwritten manuscripts. Firstly, the production of handwritten manuscripts is very slow, laborious and expensive. Because these scribes are human beings, they need a lot of time in order to meticulously copy the manuscripts. And at the same time, it takes a lot of intensive labor in order to produce just a single manuscript. And the pages of these manuscripts were also expensive, which is why the entire production of manuscripts now became quite problematic. And at the same time, the handling of manuscripts isn't very easy because these manuscripts are quite fragile. It is not really easy to keep intact and preserve the manuscripts, which is why the booksellers now realized that handwritten manuscripts could not be of great use to them, which is why around this time they also limited the production of handwritten manuscripts. But does this mean that printed materials were no longer available throughout Europe? Well, it can never happen so. And at this juncture, woodblock printing came to the rescue. So by the early 15th century, woodblocks were now being widely used throughout Europe. Earlier on in our lessons on China and Japan, we learnt about how woodblock printing technique was of great use there. And in woodblock printing technique, huge blocks of wood are engraved with certain symbols, images, representations as well as writings. And then these blocks of wood are dyed with ink, and then these are pressed on a sheet of paper or on different surfaces in order to achieve the required impression or the required printed material. And woodblock printing also became quite prevalent by the early 15th century in Europe, because these wood blocks were now being used to paint different kinds of things like textiles, playing cards, religious pictures with brief texts. So here you can see a European textile with woodblock printing, and here you can see a set of playing cards. And this is a page from a religious book in which you can see there is painting as well as text at the bottom of the page, and all these things were done through this process of woodblock printing. Now all these kinds of technologies were not very efficient when it came to producing more and more printed documents, because woodblock printing was also a hand printing technique, because the people who did woodblock printing had to do everything with their hand, which is why it required lot of effort, and at the same time this process was very intensive in nature. Now people in Europe, as in the publishers, the booksellers, now realized that they required even quicker and cheaper production methods. That is to say, these quicker and cheaper production methods would now produce more and more materials in a very short span of time. So what happened after this? This now brings us to a discussion on the German inventor, printer, publisher called Johann Gutenberg. Now Johann Gutenberg's contribution to the printing technology has been a breakthrough in this entire process, because by the 1440s he had developed a new printing technology. Now since his childhood, Gutenberg was introduced to the workings of wine presses as well as olive presses. And at the same time he was also introduced to the art of polishing stones. Now he used all this knowledge in order to bring into being a new printing technology. Now the printing technology that he brought into being was the first known printing press in Europe. And by the year 1448, Gutenberg had designed the first ever printing press, and this came to be known as the Gutenberg printing press. This was established in a place called Strasbourg in Germany. This map shows you this place called Strasbourg, where was established the first ever printing press, which was the Gutenberg printing press. Now before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. Who set up the first printing press in Europe? Was it set up by Christopher Columbus, Johann Gutenberg, Ferdinand Magellan, or Marco Polo? Well, the correct answer is Johann Gutenberg. By 1448, he had set up the first ever printing press in Europe, which was known as the Gutenberg printing press. Now let me explain to you the working of the Gutenberg printing press in detail. Here was a long handle that was attached to the screw. Then there was a platen, and then there was the printing block. Now below the printing block was the damp paper, and when this handle was moved, this platen exerted force on the printed block, and in turn the printed block now printed the engravings on the damp sheet of paper. And in this way the Gutenberg printing press used to work. You'll be surprised to know that this printing technology that evolved so many years ago, that is by the 1448, was able to print around 250 sheets on one side per hour. So this was quite efficient given the times when it was invented. Now for printing different kinds of things in the Gutenberg printing press, Gutenberg had designed the metal blocks of 26 Roman alphabets, and these 26 Roman alphabets were then moved in order to produce texts of different words. So in this way, this now came to be known as the first ever movable printing press. Now this was a breakthrough in the printing technology in the sense that prior to this kind of a machine for the purpose of printing had not evolved. Now having learnt about the Gutenberg printing press, I am sure you are very curious to know which was the first book to be printed at this printing press. Well, it was the Gutenberg Bible. Now this was the first book to be printed by Gutenberg, and the Gutenberg Bible was a short 42-line version of the Bible. This was printed for the first time by Gutenberg at this new printing press. Now while the Gutenberg printing press came into being, it did not imply that the traditional handwritten printing techniques were now completely replaced. This is because the printed books from the Gutenberg printing press initially resembled the handwritten manuscripts in appearance. Now here you can see a printed text and it absolutely resembles a handwritten manuscript. And here you can see that the letters are also very similar to the letters which were written down by the scribes in handwritten manuscripts. Well, the metal letters that Gutenberg had designed for his movable printing press actually imitated the ornamental handwritten styles, and it is for this reason that the handwritten manuscripts and printed books continued to look quite similar at this point of time. Now at the same time, illuminations were made by hand on the borders of the pages. What do we understand by illuminations? Well, in medieval manuscripts we can find illuminations which are designs of foliages and different kinds of things that are made at the borders of the pages, and these are very intricately done. These give a very rich look to the manuscripts. And in the Gutenberg printing press, while new books were being printed, in the ends of the pages illuminations were made, and these were made by hand. So here we can find a very beautiful blending or synthesis of hand printing techniques and at the same time proper printing techniques. So this was a very crucial thing to have happened in the history of Europe. So this can be considered a transitional phase in the history of European printing techniques, because at the same time we can find hand printing techniques existing simultaneously hand in hand with proper printing techniques. Now what we see here are some pages from the Gutenberg Bible. Now these absolutely resemble any handwritten manuscript simply because the metal letters were meant to imitate the handwritten styles. Now here you can see the illuminations which are made at the borders of the pages. Now the illuminations were not just foliages, but those were of different designs on different pages. Now there existed a very prevalent custom of customizing texts because the wealthy patrons used to extend patronage to the scribes as well as to the printers in order to print their books the way they wanted. And in this way, those wealthy patrons or members of the aristocratic circles wanted to ensure that their books did not look like the books of others. That is to say, their books were unique in nature, because no two pages, let alone two books, used to have similar illuminations. And here you can see the letters of certain words are highlighted. Do you know why it was done so? This is because it was meant to emphasize what is written there. This is an important teaching of the Bible, which is why it is highlighted there. So these are some of the pages of the Gutenberg Bible. Now when the Gutenberg Bible was printed for the first time, around 150 copies were printed through 3 years, and these were spread among the masses. Over the years, only 50 copies of the original Gutenberg Bible have survived, and these have been preserved in museums. Now, the introduction of the Gutenberg printing press to the history of printing technology in Europe was a breakthrough moment. This is because between 1450 and 1550, many printing presses now were set up in most European countries, because the demand for books were increasing at that point of time, as we have been discussing all along, which is why now many printing presses were being set up in order to print more and more books and cater to the masses' requirements. Now over the years, book production increased significantly. This is because if we are to trace the numbers of books that have been printed in the 15th century with the numbers of books that have been printed in the 16th century, we will be able to understand the difference. From 20 million copies of printed books in the second half of the 15th century, the number increased rapidly to around 200 million copies in the 16th century. So in just a matter of around 50 years, so many books were printed. The number increased significantly and exponentially from 20 million to 200 million. So this now tells us how important the printing technology became in Europe. And this rapid increase of printed books in Europe now gave birth to the print revolution. But what do you think is the print revolution? Well, this is the question that we will be seeking an answer to in our subsequent lesson. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million-plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.